You wake up, and without thinking about it, you know who you are. You remember your name, your relationships, the thing you said last Tuesday that you wish you could take back, the goal you've been putting off, the version of yourself you're still trying to become. It feels seamless, continuous, like there's a thread running through every version of you, the child, the teenager, the person reading these words right now, and that thread is simply you. But tonight, I want to sit with you in something a little strange. Something that, once you see it, you can't quite unsee. Not in a frightening way, in a quietly liberating way. What if that continuity isn't something you have, but something your brain builds? What if the solid, certain feeling of being you is actually one of the most sophisticated stories ever told? Authored in real time, revised constantly, and narrated by a mind that is trying, above all else, to make sense of things. What if you're not living reality directly, but living a beautifully constructed narrative about reality? And what if the one you call me is simply the main character of that story? Let's explore this slowly. There's no rush tonight. We have time to think, to wander, to wonder. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and follow me into one of the most fascinating questions a human being can ask about themselves. The brain that cannot tolerate chaos. Your brain is, before anything else, a prediction machine. It evolved not to experience the world passively, but to anticipate it, to stay one step ahead. Because in our evolutionary past, the creatures who could predict where the predator might be, or whether the stranger at the edge of the firelight was friend or threat, survived. The ones who waited passively to find out did not. So your nervous system developed a remarkable talent, pattern recognition. The ability to take fragments of incoming information, light, sound, sensation, temperature, the expression on someone's face, and weave them into something coherent, something meaningful. Here's the thing, though. Raw experience doesn't arrive with meaning attached. Right now, photons are hitting your retinas. Pressure waves are moving through the air and vibrating tiny bones in your ears. Your body is registering countless microsensations. The weight of your clothing, the temperature of the room, the subtle rhythm of your own breathing. None of that comes pre-labeled. None of it arrives with a story. Your brain provides the story. It stitches the fragments together the way a skilled film editor assembles footage, choosing what to emphasize, what to cut, what to place next to what so that meaning emerges. It finds narrative in chaos. It imposes structure on the flood. And over time, across all the accumulated moments of your life, it builds something remarkable. A character. A protagonist. You. The library of who you are. Somewhere in the vast architecture of your brain, there is something like a library. Not a physical room, of course, but a functional one. A place where experiences are stored, cataloged, cross-referenced, and retrieved. Except it doesn't work the way most of us think. We tend to imagine memory as something like a video archive, a recording that sits unchanged until we press play. You remember your 6th birthday, and you're accessing footage, a fixed file that exists exactly as it did the moment it was captured. But that's not what memory is. Memory is reconstruction. Every single time you remember something, your brain doesn't retrieve a stored file. It rebuilds the experience from fragments, filling in gaps, adjusting details, coloring the memory with your current emotions, your current beliefs, your current understanding of who you are. This has been demonstrated beautifully and somewhat unsettlingly in decades of cognitive psychology research. Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most important memory researchers of the last century, spent her career showing how fluid and malleable memory really is, how suggestion, emotion, repetition, and context can subtly or dramatically alter what we believe we remember. People can be led to remember events that never happened. Details of real events can be revised without the person knowing. The memory feels just as real, just as vivid, just as certain, but the content has changed. Your past, in other words, is not fixed. It is continuously edited. And here is the part that is worth sitting with on a quiet night like this. The editing is not random. Your brain tends to revise your memories in ways that are consistent with who you currently believe yourself to be. The story of your past is curated to support the story of your present. You don't remember what happened. You remember your current interpretation of what happened. And that interpretation is deeply, intimately connected to the identity you carry. The script running in the background. Think about the sentences you use to describe yourself. Not to other people necessarily, though those too, but to yourself. The quiet background narration that runs almost constantly. I'm not really a creative person. I've always struggled with confidence. I'm the kind of person who finishes what they start. I'm terrible at mornings. I'm good in a crisis. I push people away when I get too close. I'm the strong one. I'm the difficult one. These sentences feel like observations, like neutral facts you've simply noticed about yourself over time, the way you'd notice that grass is green or that water is wet. But they're not facts. They're script. They're character traits you've assigned to yourself, often based on a relatively small number of experiences, often absorbed from what others told you about yourself when you were young and didn't yet have the tools to question it, often calcified over time through a process called confirmation bias, where the brain, having accepted a belief, begins unconsciously filtering experience to find evidence that confirms it. You believe you're bad at relationships, so you notice every time you say the wrong thing and you smooth past every time you connect warmly with someone. The script is preserved. You believe you're not creative, so when a good idea comes, you attribute it to luck. When a bad idea comes, you use it as proof. The script holds. This isn't a flaw in your design. It's actually deeply functional. A predictable self is easier to maintain than an uncertain one. The brain doesn't like uncertainty. It prefers a known story over an unknown one, even if the known story is limiting, even if the known story causes low-level suffering. We become loyal to our own narratives, even the painful ones, because at least we know how they go. The network that tells you who you are. There is a network of brain regions, a constellation of interconnected areas, called the default mode network. Neuroscientists gave it this somewhat plain name because it activates by default. It's what your brain does when it isn't focused on an external task. When you're daydreaming, it's active. When you're remembering the past, it's active. When you're imagining the future, planning, worrying, ruminating, it's active. And crucially, when you're thinking about yourself, reflecting on your identity, your relationships, your place in the world, it's particularly engaged. Research into this network over the past 2 decades has been extraordinary. It appears to be the biological seat of narrative self, the place where your brain weaves together past and future, experience and identity, into something continuous, into the felt sense of being a consistent me across time. Here is something beautiful about this. When the default mode network quiets, as it does in certain meditative states, in deep flow, in those moments of total absorption where you lose track of time and self, the narrative loosens. The internal monologue fades. The story pauses. And what remains is simply awareness, experience without a narrator, sensation without a label, the present moment unedited. Many people who meditate report this as one of the most peaceful experiences available to human consciousness. Not nothingness, but a kind of open, quiet aliveness that exists before the story begins. Which suggests something interesting. The narrator and the experience are not the same thing. You are not only your story. Why we suffer inside our own narratives. Most psychological suffering, not all, but most of the everyday kind, is narrative repetition. Something happens once. The story replays many times. A conversation goes badly. In reality, it lasted 4 minutes, but the narrative version of it can run on loop for 4 days, 4 weeks, sometimes years. Each replay is a fresh experience of the pain, even though the event itself is long gone. This is the nature of rumination. This is the engine of regret. This is why worry feels so exhausting, because the brain, in trying to protect you by anticipating bad outcomes, runs simulated futures that feel nearly as distressing as real ones. You're not suffering from what happened. You're suffering from the story your brain keeps telling about what happened, or what might happen, or what it means about you. The event happens once. The interpretation echoes. And here's a quiet, gentle truth worth holding. The interpretation is not the event. It's a construction, a version, a draft. Which means it can be revised. Not falsified, not denied, but understood differently, with time, with distance, with compassion for the self who experienced it. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to write one of the most profound books of the 20th century, came to believe that human beings can endure almost any what if they have a strong enough why. That meaning is not something we find in the world, but something we create. That even in circumstances of unimaginable suffering, there remains a final freedom. The freedom to choose how we interpret what is happening to us. That insight, hard won as few insights ever, points to something important. We are not passive recipients of meaning. We are active makers of it. The story is always, to some degree, being written. How the brain structures a life. There is a reason that human beings across every culture, in every era, tell stories. It isn't incidental. It isn't a luxury or a pastime. It is, researchers now believe, central to how we process experience, communicate with one another, and understand ourselves. We are narrative animals. Story is not something we add to life after the fact. It's the structure through which we experience life as we live it. Your brain automatically frames experience in story-like terms. It looks for a beginning. It identifies a conflict. It anticipates resolution. And it places you at the center as the protagonist whose choices, struggles, and growth give the sequence of events their meaning. This is why we so instinctively describe our lives in narrative terms. It was the worst thing that happened to me, but it changed everything. I didn't know it at the time, but that was a turning point. Looking back, I can see that all of it was leading somewhere. Even when life is genuinely chaotic, genuinely random, genuinely without clear plot, the brain reaches for the arc. It wants rising action. It wants meaning embedded in difficulty. It wants the promise that things are moving somewhere, that suffering has a purpose, that the protagonist is growing. And sometimes this is beautiful. The ability to make meaning out of hardship is one of the most resilient things about us. But it can also trap us. When we insist the story go a certain way, when we refuse to update the narrative even when new evidence arrives, when we become so attached to a particular arc, the tragedy arc, the underdog arc, the cautionary tale, that we can't see the possibility of a different story. The roles we assign ourselves. Every story needs roles. And without realizing it, we assign ourselves roles and then live inside them with remarkable consistency. The helper, the one who is always there for others, who struggles to receive care, who defines their worth through usefulness. The achiever, the one for whom rest feels dangerous, who can't stop moving, who has built an identity on perpetual forward motion. The one who doesn't fit, the outsider, the too much or the not enough. The responsible one, the stable one, the one people lean on. The one who gets hurt, again and again, in relationships that follow the same invisible script. None of these roles are chosen consciously. They develop early, shaped by family dynamics, by how we were treated, by what we learned was safe and what wasn't, by the particular emotional climate of childhood. And then they become so familiar, so deeply woven into our sense of self, that we forget their roles at all. We think they're simply who we are. The child who learned that being helpful, kept the peace, grows into the adult who cannot say no. The child who learned that achievement, earned love, grows into the adult who equates rest with worthlessness. The child who was told they were too sensitive grows into the adult who apologizes for feeling. And the tragic thing, the thing worth sitting with tonight in the gentleness of this quiet hour, is that these roles often stop serving us long before we notice we're still playing them. Consciousness watching the story. Here is where something fascinating opens up. You are capable of watching yourself. Right now, you can notice your own thoughts. You can observe the quality of your attention. You can step back from a feeling and recognize it as a feeling rather than a fact. You can catch yourself mid-story and ask, is this true? This capacity, what psychologists and philosophers call metacognition, or what contemplative traditions have called witnessing awareness, is one of the most remarkable features of human consciousness. You are not only the character in the story. You are also, always, the awareness in which the story is taking place. And that awareness, the part of you that can watch the narrative without being entirely consumed by it, is curiously quiet, curiously still. It doesn't have opinions. It doesn't catastrophize. It doesn't cling to a particular version of events. It just watches, notices, holds space. When you meditate, even briefly, even imperfectly, what you're really practicing is the art of stepping back into that awareness, letting thoughts come and go without grabbing them, letting the story play without being the only one watching it. And in those moments, something shifts. The urgency softens. The fixed self loosens slightly. And there's a sense, quiet but real, that you are larger than your narrative, that the story is happening in you, not as you. The quiet revolution of rewriting. One of the most beautiful discoveries of modern neuroscience is neuroplasticity. Your brain is not fixed. It is not a machine stamped out at birth that simply runs its program until it stops. It is living tissue, dynamic and responsive, capable of forming new connections, reorganizing itself, learning and unlearning, growing new pathways in response to new experience. Which means the story is not finished. The script is not permanent. We used to believe that adult brains were largely locked, that who you were by a certain age was who you would remain. Now we know that's simply not true. The brain retains its capacity to change, to adapt, to rewrite itself in response to new thoughts, new habits, new experiences, new ways of seeing. Not easily, of course. Not instantly. Old narratives have deep grooves. Neural pathways that have been traveled 1,000 times don't dissolve overnight. There is patience required, and gentleness, and the willingness to feel a little uncertain as you let an old story loosen before the new one has fully formed. But it is possible. Change one belief, and the narrative around it shifts. Shift the narrative, and behavior begins to follow. Let behavior shift consistently, and the brain begins to build new pathways, new defaults, a new sense of who you are and what you're capable of. This isn't optimism for its own sake. This is biology. You are not trapped in your story. You are the author of it. What remains when the story pauses? There are moments, you've probably had them, when the narrative falls away. Standing at the edge of the ocean, watching waves come in, you forget to think about yourself for a moment. You're just there, present, absorbed. Deep in a piece of music, or in a conversation that matters, or at the end of something beautiful. A sunset, a film, a book. There's sometimes a moment where the inner commentator goes quiet, and there's just the experience itself, clean and whole. In those moments, you are still there. You are still experiencing. But the story about who you are isn't running loudly in the background. The self-consciousness lifts. The evaluation pauses. And what remains is something that feels, paradoxically, more real than the story, not less. Just awareness, just presence, just this. Meditation teachers across traditions have pointed to this space for thousands of years, in many different languages and frameworks, but with a remarkably consistent message. Beneath the story, there is something vast and quiet that is not the story. Not nothing, not void, but open, awake, alive. You don't have to become a meditator to touch this. You don't have to do anything particular. You only have to notice, in small moments, that you can step slightly back from the narrative, that you can watch it rather than only be it, that there is a you who observes the story, and that this observing self is itself a kind of freedom. A different relationship with your own mind. The invitation here isn't to stop telling stories. You can't, and you wouldn't want to. The narrative self is a gift. It allows you to plan, to learn from the past, to maintain relationships over time, to hold commitments, to dream. A life without narrative would be a strange and drifting thing. The invitation is simpler than that. To hold your story a little more lightly. To remember that the character you've built, with all their fixed traits and reliable patterns and certain self-knowledge, is a construction. A beautiful, useful, deeply human construction, but not an absolute truth. To notice when the story is serving you and when it's containing you. To ask, occasionally, who would I be without this particular sentence about myself? Not to immediately answer the question, not to force a new narrative into place before the old one has fully released, but just to sit in the question for a moment, to let it soften the certainty a little, to remember that you have written this script, even if you wrote it without knowing, and that writing is always revision. To recognize that the voices that told you who you were, the early ones, the loud ones, the ones that got in before you had any defenses, were not delivering eternal truths. They were telling you stories. And you, being young and impressionable and desperate to understand yourself and your world, believed them. Of course you did. We all did. But you are not young anymore. And you can read the story now. And you can choose what to keep. The slow unfolding. Real change, the kind that actually lasts, tends to happen slowly. It isn't usually a single moment of insight that transforms everything. It's the accumulation of small acts of noticing, small decisions to tell the story differently, small experiments in behaving as though a different belief is true. The person who has told themselves for 20 years that they are not lovable doesn't shift that narrative in an afternoon. But they might, one day, let someone in a little further than usual, and survive it, and notice that they survived it, and file that experience away somewhere in the vast library of the self. And the next time the old story plays, there is now a small counter-narrative, a gentle piece of evidence that maybe the script isn't the whole truth. And over time, slowly, the library changes. The brain is always updating, always integrating new experience, always, on some level, revising. The question is just whether we're doing it consciously or not. Whether we're aware authors or unconscious ones. The story is not the enemy. I want to be careful here, in the quiet of this hour, not to leave you with the impression that the narrative self is something to overcome, something to escape, something wrong with you that needs to be fixed. It isn't. The storytelling brain is one of the most extraordinary things in the known universe. The fact that a collection of cells can produce a self, a coherent, continuous, meaning-making entity with a past and a future and an inner life, is staggering. It is one of the great mysteries that science has not yet come close to fully explaining. Your narrative is your life. It contains everything you've learned and loved and lost. It is the shape of your particular journey through an existence that didn't have to include you at all. The problem was never the story. The problem is only when we forget it's a story. When we treat it as fixed, as complete, as the final word on who we are and what is possible for us. The map is not the territory. The story is not the self. And once you know that, once you can hold the story in your hands and see it for what it is, something opens up. Not chaos, not emptiness. Freedom. Tonight, here now. On a night like this, when the world has quieted down and you've given yourself the rare gift of stillness, it's worth asking the question that the philosophers and the contemplatives and the psychologists, in their different ways, have all been circling. Who are you without the story? Not to answer it definitively, not to arrive at some new fixed identity to replace the old one, but just to sit in the openness of the question. To notice that beneath the labels you carry and the traits you've assigned yourself and the memories you've curated and the future you've imagined, beneath all of that, there is something simply here, simply awake, simply present in this moment. That quiet awareness has been there your whole life. It was there in childhood, before the story was fully written. It was there in every moment of genuine connection, when self-consciousness dropped away. It was there at the edge of the ocean and in the dark of the theater and in the stillness just before sleep. It is there now. It is always there. And it is not afraid of the story. It is simply larger than it. You are not a fixed point. You are a living, changing, rewriting process. Your brain constructs coherence so you can function in the world, so you can love and work and grow and make sense of things. And awareness, your capacity to step back, to watch, to choose, is where your freedom lives. The story will continue. That's a beautiful thing. But now you know it's a story. And knowing that changes everything. Not loudly, not all at once. Just quietly, gently, the way all real things change. Sleep well tonight. The author is still here. And tomorrow, the story gets to be whatever you need it to be.